Sputnik. Americans took it seriously that the Soviets were ahead of us. And so here you got guys like Homer Hickam, who went to Virginia Tech and ended up going to work for NASA, who was a West Virginia coal mining kid, right? His brother in that movie went to Notre Dame, remember? And used to be the head football coach at Northside High School in Roanoke County. I knew Coach Hickam, knew him when I worked there. So those are real people, who were country boys, and they looked up and they said, the Russians are beating us, and we need to hone our skills in math and science, right? Which is it's great, and I wish more Americans were like that now. Like, let's wipe out the vaccine. Wipe out the vaccine, but wipe out the virus instead of disbelieve in the virus, right? I don't believe it's real. That's not a solution. That's head in the sand kind of thing. So, the question now became, could America, who had invested so much energy and time into consumer goods, catch up in scientific race, right? And I told you the culture would be influenced by not only, the space race, right? Outer space movies and the talk of space, but also this is during the 50s, during the Red Scare. And so the aliens would often be sort of metaphors for communists amongst our midst, like hidden amongst our midst, like they're amongst us. So this is where, the idea that we were now going to be at risk from nuclear attack starts to really play into our heads. Keep in mind, the Soviets had the nuke by 49, right? But by the 50s, they're going to start beating us into outer space. And so the fear is, well, they might send, nuclear attack to us from outer space. And one of the things really is kind of outright devastating is the enormous testing of nuclear weapons. I mean, it was a ton of nuclear weapons, bombs blown up either in the atmosphere, they call that atmospheric testing, or underground. So I wrote down some notes for myself. The last bomb, a nuke that the United States tested was in 1992. Okay, now that wasn't atmospheric, but it was still a nuclear test. The Russians drew up the biggest nuclear bomb in history in 1961. That was Tsar Bomba. It was the hydrogen bomb that was the most powerful bomb ever detonated in history. It was enormous, and you can watch about Tsar Bomba. The last nuke that we know of officially being detonated in the world was in 2017, and that was the North Koreans. They detonated a nuclear weapon in 2017. So these still exist, but the problem was they were creating enormous devastation. This is what the hydrogen bomb looks like from far, like way off, and this is the Bikini Atoll. If you know anything about an atoll, it's like a circle in the middle of land, like somehow like a hole is formed there. Well, this wasn't an atoll at first. We dropped the hydrogen bomb on it right here on a solid piece of earth, and that's what's remaining, like a giant hole. So we created this atoll. It's kind of like a sea with the water that sort of sits in the middle of it. The detonation at Bikini was so big, the aftershock was felt in Japan. Okay, and can you see down here, like there's ships out here? Can you see like ships? So this was so big, the fallout blew and actually gave Japanese fishermen radiation poisoning. So it was an unbelievably destructive bomb, right? The one dropped on Bikini. Now I've got a picture of a lady down here for a reason. A French fashion designer was making a new style of two-piece bathing suit when this was in all the news, right? So what did he choose to name his two-piece bathing suit? The Bikini. So if you ever wonder why, because it was like two pieces, see how it's a piece up here and a piece down here. So the idea is that's what he named his bathing suit. But I want to remind you of a couple things. Throughout our country, you would see basements to both average people, but also churches and city buildings would be designated fallout shelters. And that was for if there was an atomic attack. You'd have to go under cement, basically, and be underground. People began converting their basements and buying outdoor kits that you could build a fallout shelter. So you would see these in the ground. They would be like metallic building structures put up, or people's basements. And they would stock them with goods, to survive a nuclear holocaust. So really, I've seen it in culture much later, like when the Simpsons survive a nuclear attack, when Family Guy survives a nuclear attack, So it's still very much a part of the culture. You guys have had tornado drills, right? That kind of look like this picture. You hide on your desk and cover your head. Well, the covering your head is from falling debris, right? But in the 50s, it was to cover your head from falling debris from a nuclear attack. And of course, duck and cover was not meant to be. If you were at ground zero of a nuclear attack, you weren't going to be ducking and covering anything. You're going to be vaporized. But the idea was like the aftershock creates this huge wave, that kind of looks like that spreads outward, and it would knock buildings down and stuff. So you needed to have protection. So I trained for some of these, the fallout shelter, the duck and cover. We used to have an air raid siren here in Danville that would, every Saturday on noon, you'd hear it. You just hear it go off, It was like a practice, like it was his test. We created a civilian air patrol, to if I had to defend the skies kind of above us. A really intense period. Here's a movie, Godzilla. What forms Godzilla? So many nuclear tests in the Pacific, right? That we create this giant radioactive monster. He's still part of the culture too, I think. So when does the Cold War take a scary turn? Really, is in the 50s. In 57, the United States and Russia are developing intercontinental ballistic missiles. So you need to know what an ICBM is. An intercontinental, and you can write this under the missile gap, or you can write it, somewhere where you're talking about nuclear testing. But prior to 56, 57, if you wanted to deliver a nuclear weapon, it was either by a bomber, or we did have what were called IRBMs. So an IRBM is a towed truck missile. It's a missile that you can tote, so to speak, and put on a rocket pad. So let's see if I can find some. Yeah, here we go. Soviets use them or had them a lot. I don't use them, thank goodness. So an IRBM is an intermediate range ballistic missile. These were the big dogs. These were the ICBM. So if you understand what IRBM, that's kind of towed, right? You see how that's on a truck bed? So this is what the Russians had, and rocketry. And we decided we had to outdo them. And so we're going to build these massive Atlas missiles. And what these things do is they go up into space. So let me get you a missile launch. Let me get you a deterrent or a MAD picture, because this will show you what. ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, right? ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic. I'm looking at the world's longest. It's almost 10,000 miles. So this thing could go 10,000 miles, the biggest ones around the world. Okay. So if you're thinking about how this works, take a look at this picture. It's a great example. Let me pop one more in there. This is a great idea to take and understand, because it really was something in outer space, y'all. Like it would go up. Now, when you think about America, where we're located, imagine this is somewhere in Eastern Canada, Kamchatka or somewhere like that. So what it would do is it would go over the top of the world, right? Over the North Pole. People look at the map and say, what, did it go east to west like this? No, that would be foolish. It'd be foolish to launch a missile from Russia and make it go to the east to America, right? So they're actually shooting it over the North Pole, which is quite faster. And of course, it makes more sense. And so the missile would go up, and the warhead would then be released, and it would land on multiple places in America or around our country. So we created, as a response to this, I should show you all this, the DEW line. You guys know the DEW line? Ever heard of it? So DEW stands for Distant Early Warning Line, right? The DEW line. And these were, working with the Canadians, we would erect radars all around the North Pole, and then it would set off a warning to us. So you can see these green ones, right? So imagine the missiles are going to come from the top. And so well before they reach America, we would get notification from the DEW line, D-E-W. And then what would we do in theory if they launch missiles at us? Fire a retaliatory strike, and the missiles would kind of pass each other in space, right? And then mushroom clouds everywhere. And I remind you guys, nobody wins a nuclear war unless you can pull off what? Yeah, completely annihilating them before they have a chance to respond. Well, there's only one way really to do that, and that's to have what's called first strike capability. Okay, so where do you got to be to get first strike capability? Space, all right, that's possible. Yeah, that's excellent, but not something they're ready to do yet. How about within the DEW line? All right. So if you want to be able to hit us so fast, our guys don't have a spot. Nowhere up there is going to be within the DEW line, is it? I mean, what are they going to do? Take over Canada? So you should be thinking about if I'm the Soviets. Because by the way, we have nukes. We have IRBMs, not the ICs, but the IRBMs. Guess where? Where would you put a nuke if you wanted first strike on in the Soviet Union? Somewhere over there. Yeah, yeah. How about, I'll show you. Norway would be all right, yeah, but that would require the Norwegians to let us do that, and they might not do that.
Turkey.
Yeah, how about that? How about in Turkey? Yeah, sure. We were friends with Turkey. They were in NATO, and we have a big old air base in Turkey called Incirlik, which to this day still holds 50 nuclear weapons. So if you think about where our nukes were, and I can promise you this, the Russians were well aware of where they were, right? So take a look over here. Air bases with either nuclear planes or actual nuclear, like nuclear launch. So you see Incirlik right there? Aviano in Italy right there. So we could launch, see this? There's the Soviet Union right across the Black Sea. So that's really close, right? Like we could hit them with a missile. And they knew that, and it scared them. Now, I told you that the Sputnik stimulated President Eisenhower. He's like, we got to do something about this. So he is going to get Congress to shower billions of dollars. I mean, like multiple billions of dollars on a brand new space program. NASA, all right, NASA, National Aeronautics Space Administration. And NASA was created in 57 as well. And, well, not in 57, but it's a result of 57. And our first attempt at a missile launch on TV is this picture right here. So initially, it blew up on launch. Initially, we did very badly at this. So the Russians were clearly ahead of us. And this was kind of embarrassing. Every time we'd have a rocket failure, it would make the headlines. And so after putting billions of dollars in it, does anybody know who the first man in space was for America? All right, good. So when did John Glenn do what John Glenn did? All right, not quite that early or late, I think. Here we go. 62, you're right. He was the third in space. Neil Armstrong was the man on the moon. Who was our first astronaut in space? It was Alan Shepard. Alan Shepard was the first American in space. First American in space. Yeah, Alan Shepard. Glenn was the third, first to orbit the Earth. American to orbit. So this is Alan Shepard. I'll show y'all. And he went up in 61, and he was only the second man ever to go into space. Here's Alan Shepard and Mercury 7. Okay. Mercury 7. So we do put a man in space in 61. Okay. The Russians beat us, though. We were really trying hard to get into space before them. And this is Mercury. That's what the Mercury capsule looked like. My dad was in the Navy and retrieved Mercury capsules. Like, not him personally. He was an electrician, maybe. But this is Alan Shepard. And then you said John Glenn, and you're right to say John Glenn. He was one of our most recognizable heroes. This is John Glenn. He would be the first man to orbit the Earth from America. He was also the oldest person to ever go into space because he went up as an old man as a U.S. Senator. I'll show you John Glenn twice. So John Glenn was an American hero, man, one of my big favorite characters in our history. So John Glenn went up in 62 and orbited the Earth. I forget how many rotations. Then he went up again I guess it was in the 70s. That's John Glenn when he went up as a U.S. Senator. And they were doing tests on age in outer space, like what impact that would have. So we're going to start catching up, but at every turn, the Russians are ahead of us. I'm not going to put Yuri Gagarin on my awesome American PowerPoint here, but the Russians beat us first satellite into space, first rocket into space, first animal into space, and first person into space. So it felt like we were kind of losing, and these are like test pilots. You guys know what a test pilot is? Somebody who flies an airplane that nobody's ever seen fly before. So what's it probably going to do? Crash, blow up, something. And these are guys who volunteer to fly a test plane. That's how cool they are. Glenn was a Marine. Shepard was I want to say he was a Navy pilot. So the other major response, and I know I don't have it here for you, but you need to write it down. It is the NDEA. So what is the NDEA? Love this thing. The National Defense, that makes sense, right? It's Cold War. National Defense Education Act. Right. So I love it. I wish somebody, after 9/11, I was really hoping for a huge investment in education in America to learn Pashto and Farsi and Arabic and to, become an expert on the war on terror kind of thing. Right. Well, in the Cold War, we had a huge investment in public education in STEM. Right. So what's STEM? Science, isn't it? Engineering, math, technology, and also in foreign languages. So usually when we talk about the federal government, they hadn't gotten that much involved in education in a while, had they? But this was America's defense depended on it. That was the argument. And so normally you can't get a multi-billion-dollar education bill through Congress. That's a state problem, right? Not a federal problem. But at this point, our lack of education as a nation was a federal problem, they said. And the NDEA, know that, and man, it surely helped pay off. So what an interesting period to be alive. And remember when I told y'all about Homer Hickam, right? The kid from October Sky, how he received a scholarship and got a grant. That's this stuff. So, all across the country, young people were being inspired to become scientists, which is great. That's the kind of stuff you want young people to be inspired to do. Or baseball players, one or the other. Both of them are pretty cool. Why not have scientists who are baseball players? So let's get back to Ike and what's going on with us and the Russians. Okay. So you got this new guy who's the leader of the Soviet Union. He's a really belligerent kind of dude. But it turns out he's kind of interested in kissing and making up. What we're looking for under Eisenhower is a phrase that's going to become known as peaceful coexistence. Later on in history, we're going to call it détente, right? Like the French word for relaxation. What Ike recognizes, what's not working, plus you, is rollback. Did rollback actually, have we done it at all? I mean, he's been president now for 7 years, and we haven't uncommunisted any country, have we? In fact, communism has spread a little bit. The best we can do is hope to stop it. So he invites and is surprised that Khrushchev accepts this invitation, and he comes to America, okay? And he tours the United States. He goes to Disneyland, goes to a couple other places, but he starts at a new retreat that was built for the president away from Washington, D.C., and it's named after his son. This is Camp David. And Camp David is the president's retreat in Maryland. It's out in the woods and the wilderness kind of Maryland, and it's like old camping houses, like that you would see at a campground almost. And I mean, they're nice, but it's not like super. But it's country and it's an escape from the city. So presidents today fly helicopters out to Camp David for some time alone in the woods. Let me see if I can find a Camp David aerial view. It's a neat place. Yeah, this is what Camp David looks like from Google Earth or Google Maps. So it's a sort of, that's kind of good to see there. Does that work? It doesn't show up real clearly, does it? I know you guys at home are like, we can't see what you're talking about, but here it is. So Camp David is a nice place for presidents to come and hang out, and it's named after David Eisenhower. There it is. So you can see it's a sizable compound. You got the helicopter landing down here. But at the same time, it's away. And so it gives a president a chance to hang out with foreign leaders or, wherever, and sort of have a personal interaction with them, if that makes sense. And so Ike and Khrushchev kind of get along a little bit here. And it looks like they're going to maybe be able to move forward on some negotiations. And this is really the first time the Russians and Americans have hung out face to face since World War II, like chatted each other up. So they decide, by the way, one of the other things that Khrushchev does is he has one of the greatest interactions of the whole Cold War. It's called in history the kitchen debate. And this is the thing that's going to catapult Nixon back into the spotlight. Remember who the vice president was Richard Nixon, right? And Nixon invites Khrushchev to come around. And I've got this on my YouTube playlist. It's so cool. He invites Khrushchev to come into an American shopping center place. So they go to a model shopping center, and in it, they've got an American kitchen, an American living room, and they know that this is being broadcast into Russia, right? But the Russians are going to have this too. And the thing about it is that America's standard of living is so high. We want to show the Soviet people, this is how great it is. So we're talking about it. And Nixon's like, we have great automobiles and appliances, and maybe the thrust of your rockets is better than ours right now. And then Khrushchev's like, no, 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 you're just not better than ours. Nothing about you. So they're having this kind of debate about what standard of living and what way of life is better, our way of life or the Soviet way of life. And I would say Nixon wins the debate. And Nixon was an old lawyer. He's really gifted at it. But Khrushchev refuses to concede anything. Like in the whole thing, he's like, no, no, no. You see him like he's got this cowboy hat on at times. He's like shaking his hand no. So if you ever want to watch an interesting interplay, because that seemed to be the exchange, is that they were beating us in science and we were beating them in awesomeness, in like society. Like they were sacrificing their personal lives for the good of the glory of the Soviet Union. And we're like not into all that. But what Nixon was saying is like, we can really do both. We can catch up with your rockets. We just didn't know we were supposed to be, right? Like, we didn't know there was a space race until you told us. So anyway, this was a great Cold War moment, and I'd encourage you to check it out if you've never seen it. So one of the things they decided at Camp David is to meet again the next year at Paris and sort of work out maybe a meaningful interaction, like some sort of even maybe an agreement, right? The problem is somebody screwed up, all right? Now, by the way, if you didn't know this, it is against the rules of law of countries for other countries' planes to fly over them without their permission, right? You understand? It's called airspace, the space above your country. Other countries' people aren't supposed to just like fly around it. And so the Russians, the Soviets were pretty confident that America was spying on them from like the skies, like way up. And the fact of the matter is we had developed a very, very good spy plane. And its name is U-2. So this is known in history as the U-2 spy plane incident. And Eisenhower had asked his Defense Department, like, look, can these things be shot down? And they're like, no, there is no way a Russian is going to be able to shoot this thing down because it's got this special paint that like radar doesn't notice it. And, it'll be great. We're going to get all this information on where the nukes are in Russia. And so I could actually deny that we spied on Russia. Like he said, we don't fly planes over Russia. And then Khrushchev's like, oh yeah, well, who's this guy? And so what happened was, this is Colonel Francis Powers, Gary Francis Powers, they called him. And Powers was shot down. A surface-to-air missile shot down an American U-2 over Russia, over the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower was really embarrassed. He's like, yeah, he had actually said, we don't spy. And then we were caught sort of red-handed doing it. Now, one of the reasons why he could say this, American pilots were supposed to commit suicide. Now, that's crazy, right? We're not the Japanese. But they had this pill, rather than be captured, don't allow yourself they had a cyanide pill. And Powers didn't take his, and so they put him on trial in Moscow as a spy. Well, guys, this is really embarrassing and hurts our relationship with the Soviets. And so the Paris Peace Conference never happened. The Paris Summit never happened. It was the same year. It was right before this. But, this was right before the conference. Powers, by the way, if you're curious about him, there's a great Steven Spielberg movie made about it with Tom Hanks called Bridge of Spies. And in it, we exchange captured Soviet spies in America for Powers. Like we do a prisoner exchange, and so that's a neat movie called Bridge of Spies. Like how they actually get the character that Tom Hanks plays was an ordinary civilian because they don't want the government's fingerprints all over it, So the civilian escorts these Russians to be exchanged for our pilot, Powers. And so he survives. He comes back to America. This was an embarrassing moment. Okay. So know the U-2 spy plane incident for sure. Other areas of foreign policy. How about Latin America? So by far, the two most noted coup d'etats during this period, during Eisenhower's period, is in Iran, remember, when the Shah is installed over Mossadegh, and the other is in Guatemala. So the CIA is all over this. The CIA doesn't like Arbenz. So Arbenz is democratically elected, but he's a leftist. He's a socialist, right? Socialists are way too close to what other is. Communist, right? Like he's practically a communist as far as we're concerned, particularly if he's going to nationalize American businesses. Like we are not going to let that happen. You remember what happened with the Suez Canal, right? And we don't want that. All of these independent countries. So the CIA is going to come coordinate within Guatemala a dictatorship to take over. And the CIA's fingerprints are all over it. So a lot of Latin American journalists and political leaders know the CIA orchestrates this in Guatemala. And guys, this is the first of literally a half dozen of coups that we're going to lead in Latin America. By the 1960s, we're going to start down in Fort Benning, Georgia, a place called the School of Americas. And the School of Americas is literally trained to create dictators who will stop communism. So we're going to help install several dictators from here all the way into the 90s, late 80s, 90s, in Latin America. And that's been very much a part of our history that Latin Americans are aware of, but most Americans aren't aware of. You know, they don't know that we overthrew the government of Guatemala. Well, the Latin Americans do. But that creates a really bizarre problem because we're so busy in Guatemala, we don't pay attention 90 miles off our coast. Now, 90 miles off our coast is a strong-armed dictator, right? So if you look on here, you guys, so if you're looking at Castro, right? So Castro is going to come to power in 59. And that is because the Cuban government in 59 is completely pro-American. Okay. So if you look at Batista's government back then, and that's what this fellow's name, Fulgencio Batista. I'm looking to see if I could find some American business pictures. This is an example of a gold phone the ITT Corporation, which is like AT&T, but a different company, gave to Batista. So this guy was having tons of American businesses set up shop. The mob had set up shop in Havana. So like the gangsters of American history, the most famous gangsters, they decided that Atlantic City was a little too much trouble. The feds were paying a little bit too much attention because like Jimmy Hoffa and stuff like that. So they set up shop in Cuba. This is depicted in the film The Godfather Part 2, if you ever see that movie. And Castro was this sort of doctor. He was a doctor, but he was a military guerrilla, that kind of training. And he and a fellow named Che Guevara are going to start a revolution in 59. Now we're, kind of missing this, and he succeeds. He overthrows Batista before the CIA can do anything about it, And so in a very quick amount of time, from 59 to 60, Castro is now the leader of the country. And what do you think he immediately does in Cuba? He nationalizes it. And look at what JFK says. JFK, during his campaign, says this about Cuba. It's pretty fascinating. Kennedy says, at the beginning of 59, Americans owned 40% of their sugar, 90% of their mines and minerals, almost all their cattle, 80% of their utilities, and 2/3 of their imports. So basically, Cuba had become an outpost of the United States, right? But who wasn't feeling the benefit, according to Castro? The Cuban people, right? The not Cuban rich people, but the ordinary Cuban people. So what do you think Castro is going to do as soon as Castro is an overt communist? By the way, as soon as he does this, who immediately recognizes his government and invites him to their country? Khrushchev. So they're like, yes, we'll love having this communist 90 miles off the coast of the United States. Are you kidding? And so immediately they back Khrushchev. And we're stuck holding the bag, kind of like, oh my God, we just had a communist revolution in our backyard, right? We're focusing on Korea and Vietnam, and now right here is. So that's one of the things that Kennedy's going to run on. Like, you guys really dropped the ball here, right? Anti-communist. So Batista's out, and Castro comes in and gets tight with Khrushchev. And this is going to create a problem. So I'll tell you right now, Eisenhower gives the thumbs up, green lights a mission 60 for the next year. Now, he's not going to be president in 61, but the assumption is maybe Nixon will be. So in 1961, under the CIA, they're going to overthrow Castro as their goal. It's like the coup d'etat attempt. Well, that's going to be a different president. And when we get to that thing, it's going to be a total fiasco. All right. So definitely understand that Castro is a who? What kind of person? He's a communist, right? And fully so. And, his brother, Raul, gave up power, I think it was like last year, like at the end of last year. Castro died, I'd say a couple of years ago, but he had been in power for like 60 years, like my whole life plus more. So Castro was and then his brother took over, and then now he's dead. No, he's not dead, but he stepped down. So the argument is Cuba is still relatively communist today, but there's no more Soviet Union. So they've had a really tough road to go with that. So one of the things that Ike wants to do is to shore up relationships with Latin America. And so we're going to say, please come up here and talk to us, our good friends from Latin America, and guarantee us that there won't be any communists in your country. So the Organization of American States doesn't want to do business with Castro. And we kind of refuse to the OAS kind of refuses to say communism is going to be something they support. You know, they're like, we hate communism. We have to talk to our OAS friends, right? So I told you your DBQ would be on Truman and particularly Eisenhower as well, the 50s, late 40s and 50s. So I want to give you kind of a summary here to remember, some of the key events. So these are like hot spots of a foreign affairs at that time. So if you kind of think of it as like Europe is going to have a lot of hot spots, right? So if you see here, you've got the Warsaw Pact, the Hungarian Revolution. You put in here the 59, and then 60 U-2 spy plane incident. You might even go back further earlier and do some of Ike's earlier stuff, or even Truman, right? Like the Berlin blockade. Remember that thing under Truman? So you definitely want to remember that, okay, in the Berlin airlift. In the Middle East, you had the Iranian Revolution, not the revolution, excuse me, the Iranian coup d'etat, sorry, Suez Crisis, and in Lebanon, okay? And then you had in Latin America, and I didn't mention Puerto Rican independence, but that's come and gone in American history. Like Puerto Ricans periodically want to be an independent country or an American state, like depending on the 52 to 51% kind of 48 to 52 swing, and it does swing pretty closely since the 50s. They kind of go back and forth. Being part of America gets a lot of good stuff, but they're not a state, so they don't get some good stuff. Anyway, be familiar with all of that stuff, all right? Because your DBQ is mostly on foreign policy and domestic policy and how it affected it. So think about things like the NDEA, NASA, the Highway Act, right? Like all of that stuff was connected to the Cold War. And of course, culture and social life as well. So let's talk about 1960. This is probably, I think, from my recollection, the closest presidential election in history. Like you're talking about 1,000 votes or less determining who the president of the United States in the modern era is. So Richard Nixon has kind of rebranded himself a little bit. He's still a famous Cold Warrior. This is the guy who was from HUAC, remember? But as a vice president, he's sort of now become kind of a statesman. Like over time, Nixon has sort of matured into the role of leader. And so he's sort of seen, and by the way, he won the nomination just like that. Ike had been president 2 terms comfortably. Nixon was his vice president. It made sense he'd be the candidate. And he won easily. You see here, though, that the Dems go through sort of an interesting identity crisis because they really like John Kennedy, except for one thing. What's wrong with Kennedy, so to speak? Not really a wrong thing, but at the time, 1960.
He's Catholic.
He's Catholic. And the South historically is vehemently anti-Catholic, right? And he's a Democrat. So he's going to run, but he gives a couple really good speeches about why his religion and religious beliefs should not prevent him from being president. And he's not like Al Smith. Y'all remember Al Smith? Al Smith, the Happy Warrior, was kind of like a down-to-earth city guy and really was a little too Yankee-ish. Well, Kennedy's got an odd accent, but Kennedy was a war hero. You understand? He was PT-109 was the patrol boat that he was the captain of that got blown up by a Japanese sub. It broke his back in the explosion, right? And caught on fire. He, with the oil and the fire still burning, with a broken back, carried another sailor and swam, like swimming with him, like a lifeguard swim, all the way to this island and helped rescue him. And after the war, he was in a body cast and like he was in terrible physical pain for quite some time. He won the Pulitzer Prize for writing a book while he was all, messed up called Profiles in Courage about senators who went against the norm. And then he ran for Senate for Massachusetts and won easily. His father was Joe Kennedy. And John Kennedy's an interesting guy because he wasn't supposed to be the president in the Kennedy family, at least not the first one. His brother was supposed to be president, his oldest brother. And his brother was a fighter pilot, or bomber pilot, excuse me. And he got shot down in World War II. John Kennedy, the oldest brother, got killed. And so then sort of the mantle of who will carry the Kennedy name forward. And Joseph Kennedy groomed all of his sons to be leaders, and they all were. John, Bobby, and Ted were all U.S. senators, just to give you a sense of how big that family was. And so he's very popular in the North, in New England area, particularly. He's from Massachusetts. He had an absolutely beautiful wife, very glamorous wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. And Kennedy was successful enough in the campaign trail. His chief campaign advisor was his brother, Bobby Kennedy, and who will always be sort of his partner in all of this. But as you can see, there were several southern states who defected or two. Alabama and Mississippi didn't even vote for Kennedy. They voted for the governor of Virginia, all right, Byrd. So it comes down to a very, very close election in Illinois. Illinois goes Democrat barely. And there is some allegation, and I think some evidence, that Joseph Kennedy literally bought votes in Illinois, like helped purchase votes for Kennedy. Now, I will tell you why I think ultimately John Kennedy prevailed, besides the fact that his dad might have helped buy it off. And that is because of television. So it's ironic because Nixon was the first TV candidate, so to speak, to save his spot with a checker speech, right? Remember that? Well, this was one of the first major elections that would feature the two candidates debating on television. And they did a public opinion poll. And if you listen to the debates on radio, you thought Nixon won, like the interplay between the two. If you watched the debates on TV, you thought Kennedy won, right? It's how different it was, because particularly the last debate they had, Nixon had been campaigning in Greensboro, North Carolina, and he brushed against a sharp, like, tabletop, and it cut his leg, and he got infected, and he didn't get treatment for it because he's on the campaign trail. And so he was sick at the debate, and he sweated profusely, and you could see it on TV. And he kind of had, Nixon always sort of had a 5 o'clock shadow. You know what that means? Like, by the end of the day, his beard had kind of popped out a little bit. And so he didn't wear makeup. He didn't want makeup. Well, meanwhile, John Kennedy was suntanned, right? Like laid out and tan. And John Kennedy loved being outdoors. I told you he broke his back badly, right, in the war. He had a serious back problem that he had to take painkillers for. He was probably an opiate addict, during his presidency. And that was just, and he would often have to have braces to hold his back up. And he hid that from the American public completely. Nobody knew this. Obviously infamous for his scandals with his mistresses. But at the time, the press didn't write about this. They knew that Kennedy fooled around with Marilyn Monroe. They knew that Kennedy had other mistresses, but nobody printed that. That just wasn't the way business was back then. So it comes down to a handful of votes, literally, and Kennedy wins. Okay, and we'll get to the Kennedy presidency in a second. But before we kind of sail away from the 50s, I do want to take you back to Eisenhower, because Eisenhower is going to give one of the most noted farewell addresses in history. I don't think I have this on your notes. And I do have key advice. So this number 6, right? So Eisenhower, when he left office, was still hugely popular. Okay, I mean, he was a mammothly popular figure in America. And Eisenhower would routinely appear later after his presidency with Kennedy. There are lots of recordings of Kennedy and Eisenhower talking to each other on the phone. It's really cool in a way, But nonetheless, Eisenhower gives his farewell address, and in his farewell address is this picture up here at the top. He gives a speech, and it's kind of not a lecturing speech, but like a grandfatherly talk speech, right? And he's talked about his legacy and everything, but near the end of it, he says, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex." But when he gives that speech, he's saying that these people who make weapons aren't the people who have to use them to fight. You understand? And their success is on making weapons. That's their life. That's their business. And we have become, as America, we must be careful of becoming dependent on these people, right? Even though he was a general, President Eisenhower was deeply concerned about America's sort of growing addiction towards military spending, because he believed that pushes you towards using them, and it takes away from everything else. So look up, I actually went back and found a speech he gave in 1953. That was like the year he took office, right? And in this speech, he said, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children." And then he comes down and he goes on and explains like what dollar amounts a bomber could be. A bomber could be a whole school in 30 cities, right? Or, 2 hospitals or 50 miles of road. We pay for a destroyer with new homes that could have housed 8,000 people. So when I teach y'all about, these planes that are completely unnecessary and obsolete that cost $1.2 trillion, that's a ton of housing. That's a ton of education. That means your college tuition shouldn't be that expensive. That means that healthcare should be more affordable, right? But nonetheless, look at what he says. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. And I think that's really fascinating. Like he closed that speech with a cross of iron, reminiscent of what? Iron Curtain or a cross of gold. Yes, thank you. Yeah, right. In other words, like an old, like don't sacrifice mankind on the cross of gold. I'd say don't sacrifice mankind on a cross of iron, right? Like a warfare. And I think that was pretty impressive. And the only reason I give this serious credibility is it's Eisenhower. I mean, he's a 5-star general who won World War II, and he ain't wrong. He is not wrong. And I've spent my whole life noticing that. Okay, so that'll be the end of Eisenhower, and it looks like we've got a few minutes we can get into the 60s with. Awesome. So Kennedy comes into office on a wave of optimism. Okay, I have here his New Frontier, but actually it should just take you back to his. This is his inaugural address. And again, you can totally watch this on TV. But in the middle of his speech, he says, let every nation know that we shall pay any price or bear any burden to ensure the survival of liberty, right? Pay any price, bear any burden. Well, if you're the communist, you're like, oh, okay, that's tough talk, right? But if you're a third world country saying, I wonder if this new president is going to help us, do you feel pretty helpful after that? You're like, oh, yeah, he's going to bear any burden, all right? Pay any price. And that's a clear signal that Kennedy wants to be a cold warrior. He does not want to be soft on communism. You understand? By the way, I will point out one other thing about the Kennedys. Joe Kennedy was also our ambassador to Great Britain. At the time, Britain did appeasement in Munich, and he was one of the architects of appeasement with Chamberlain. So what do you think the Kennedy name is now associated with? Appeasement, and Democrats are thought to be soft on communism. So Kennedy, he has got a bugaboo up, you know, I got to prove that I'm tough, right? But the other part of his inaugural, which is probably even more famous, is his closing line. And he looks out at the American people, particularly American young people, like your age, okay? And when he says, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, what is that a challenge? It's a challenge to public service. It's a challenge to serving America. It's a challenge to help your fellow Americans, right? Stop being selfish from the 50s. Stop being self-absorbed. How can I help? And this was an inspirational call. These are young people who wanted to be like, there's got to be more to life than just stuff, right? Kennedy really hit home with that. And so that speech really inspired a generation. And I think it's one reason why Kennedy is so popular is this speech. You know, this ask not what you can do, ask what you can do for your country. So know that inaugural address, okay? That's Chief Justice Earl Warren right there. You guys remember Warren Court? Yeah. And that's Vice President Lyndon Johnson. And by the way, Johnson is on the ticket to help secure. Johnson is a U.S. Senator Majority Leader from Texas, right? A very famous Southern state, right? Obviously. So by having a Texan on the ballot with him, a Massachusetts man, he's trying to have regional balance. So the Southerners can feel safe that this Texan will at least maybe keep him in check. All right. So when he comes in, his proposal or his sort of agenda, right? That's what we call this. It's called the New Frontier. So yet another new something, right? So New Deal. Before that was Wilson's New Freedom. Now it's Kennedy's New Frontier. And then you had TR with the Square Deal and Truman with the Fair Deal. So keep up with all these deals and news. All right. New Frontier. And a frontier, of course, keep in mind, what thing has been closed since 1890? The frontier, right? The West. Yeah. So this is a new frontier. And in this new frontier, some of what you should know about is the image that Kennedy projects of youth and athleticism and his family, and that's called Camelot, sort of like a hazy glow around the Kennedys. You know, they had this beautiful home in Massachusetts in Hyannisport, and they had lots of pictures together. And like I said, his wife was like a model who wore French clothing, you know, sort of like French fashion clothing, real name fashion. Here's the book I told you that Kennedy wrote and got the Pulitzer for. It was his sort of coming out as an intellectual. Now, it was actually ghostwritten. I'm going to tell you all that now. Like Kennedy oversaw it, but he didn't really do the day-to-day writing of it. But one of the things that he was most supportive of was a new program to promote American sort of love abroad, and that was called the Peace Corps. So the Peace Corps has never had that many people in it, and it's never had that much. It's never done that much, but it's always been sort of a famous thing because it seems so cool. So what it would be like after you graduated college, you would volunteer in the Peace Corps and be sent to somewhere that was like a third world country and help them purify water or help them build bridges or, as a oversee and help these programs. So it's kind of like, it's not dollar diplomacy, which is businesses, but it's more like service diplomacy. Like, let's send these nice young Americans. And they were usually like 22, 21-year-olds. And, they get food and that was about it. And the Peace Corps still exists. But I want to tell you that this is almost more symbolic. It's like, look at us being nice to all your country, as opposed to taking them over. But his agenda was called the New Frontier, and a lot of it was orchestrated by what Lyndon Johnson mockingly called the Harvards. All right, now Lyndon Johnson went to like West Texas Teachers College, like a step up from BCC, I guess. But these guys that all were the advisors to Kennedy went to Harvard. Kennedy went to Harvard. His brother went to Harvard. The Secretary of Defense went to Harvard. And so they would often be called the Harvards. And so let's go over who some of these are, okay? So here's the three Kennedy brothers. This is John, Bobby, Robert, and Ted, okay? So, by the way, Kennedy's family called him Jack. So he was Jack Kennedy to people who knew him and liked him, So Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, it was Robert Kennedy. Now, Robert Kennedy, at the age of, one other thing I should mention about Kennedy, youngest president ever elected, right? No. Yes, youngest president ever elected. Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest president ever because he succeeded to the presidency when McKinley got shot. But by the time he got elected, he was older than John Kennedy, okay? He was, I want to say 43 at the time. Let me double check. John Kennedy's age. He was not old. I don't want junior. John Kennedy, JFK. He was in 61. Who was that? I don't need that. Oh, Senator Kennedy, the new Senator Kennedy. He was 44. He was 43 when he got elected. 43 when he was elected. So younger than me, like 4 years younger than me. Yeah, he's just a mere chap when he got elected. In fact, he was killed before my age. So he was relatively young, and Bobby was 35, I believe, if memory serves, when he took the office of Attorney General. Right. So here's Bobby Kennedy with Martin Luther King, and Bobby Kennedy had never practiced law. He'd never been a lawyer, and now he was going to be Attorney General of the United States. So this is kind of nepotism, and you know what I mean by nepotism, where you pick your family member. But he was a Harvard law graduate, and JFK said, well, he'll just get on-the-job training, which is kind of interesting. And Bobby Kennedy actually proved to be a fairly effective Attorney General, considering what he was up against, all right? What he was up against are these two situations. So the guy on the right is J. Edgar Hoover. And what Bobby Kennedy wanted to do, I am going to tell you a little bit about Bobby Kennedy. He's going to run for president and assassinate. Bobby Kennedy wanted the FBI, the Justice Department, to enforce civil rights law and to go after organized labor. This is Jimmy Hoffa. Remember him? He hadn't disappeared yet. All right. So what Bobby Kennedy wanted to do was protect the rights for African Americans and break the bad labor union leaders, so to speak. The FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, was not interested in that. What does Hoover want to go after primarily? Communists and Martin Luther King. See, by the way, I should tell you about J. Edgar Hoover a little bit. Since I have a lot of respect for his 60-year service in the United States, don't get me wrong. But J. Edgar Hoover was closeted homosexual, okay? And he picked his boyfriend to be his partner, like throughout his whole career, just about. They had a partnership. And he would wear women's clothing, among other things, like a cross-dresser. But he was a brutal guy. And it's kind of a fascinating story. And he bugged Martin Luther King's house and telephones and offices, among others, not him personally, but the FBI did. And when King, I don't know if you guys knew it or not, but King had a mistress too. And when King's in a relationship with his mistress, they recorded it and sent it to Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's wife. Like they were trying to intimidate him to quit. So this is some nasty stuff going on right now, But Bobby Kennedy's trying to keep in mind that Attorney General is over the FBI. But the director of the FBI was practically a czar. Hoover wasn't going to be pushed around by anybody. So Bobby Kennedy is going to focus on civil rights primarily and on going after the Teamsters and Hoffa. The two guys here are Sorensen and Ted, and I forget his other key advisor. You don't have to know, but they were JFK's two principal advisors were also Harvard graduates, and that's these guys are in the White House. And then they brought over from Ford Motor Company the CEO of Ford to become the head of the Defense Department. And it kind of makes sense because what he wanted to do was to make the Defense Department more efficient and streamlined. And this young guy, Robert McNamara, and that's his name, Robert McNamara, was a kind of a whiz kid at Ford who had turned them around, and now they were making a lot of money. You understand? So the idea was that he was going to clean up the Defense Department and kind of make it run smoother. Unfortunately, this guy is going to take us down the rabbit hole of Vietnam. McNamara is one of the major reasons why we fight in Vietnam. And he, in his memoir, written years later in the 80s, early 90s, he is going to admit that the whole thing was a mistake. And man, that's going to tick off a lot of Vietnam vets, you know, because here's the guy who basically sent them over there saying, oops, I shouldn't have done that. He was the Secretary of Defense. Yeah, Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. So the key one here is Attorney General Bobby Kennedy and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. And you can remember that Bobby Kennedy had to deal with the FBI, and that was one of the reasons why the whole civil rights debate was difficult, because Bobby Kennedy seriously cared about the rights of African Americans. I mean, he was way more progressive in that respect than even John Kennedy was. Okay, and J. Hoover was not like at all. Hoover was not at all sympathetic for black rights. Like he could care less. You know, so that's where that is. So what happens to the new frontier? We'll close with this today, I think. What happens with the new frontier? So Kennedy had proposed sort of an expanded New Deal stuff, right? Give me just a second.
Catherine Warren, Tracy Taylor, Mia Davis, Caitlin Bowen, Grace Atkins, Mason Lewis, and Troy Edmonds. Please report to the main office at this time. Thank you very much. Hope everybody has a great and safe afternoon.
Okay, guys, so Kennedy comes in and he kind of wants to have a liberal agenda like Truman, like FDR, right? Like more progressivism, more leftism, so to speak. The problem is, and man, is this a problem that he just can't get through, is that Southern Democrats, think of them as the old Dixiecrats, right? Work with the Republicans to stop most of his agenda. You understand? Like he doesn't get very much passed at all. In fact, Kennedy is often considered by some historians the most overrated of presidents. He didn't get much done before he gets killed. But nonetheless, he does get some stuff done. But they kill particularly elderly medical care. So they kill what we now know as Medicare. Lyndon Johnson's going to get it quite easily, and we'll talk about that. See, here's the thing. Kennedy's death means all this stuff's going to get passed. What are you going to do, vote against your dead president? That's literally what LBJ says. I mean, LBJ is a tough guy. What are you going to do, vote against the body of your dead president? You know, he would tell congressmen and senators that. They're like, oh. You know, so anyway, no Medicare, no HUD improvements, housing and urban upkeep, and no federal money to education. But they did have some benefits. Social Security was expanded, minimum wage grew, and you had an Equal Pay Act that didn't really get much accomplished, but it sure sounded good on name. You remember all these acts have to have enforcement, right? What do enforcement need? They need some office in the federal government to actually do it. Is the Justice Department going to make sure businesses are making sure people are paying women and men equally? No. You know, so, I mean, it's nice to pass laws, but what do you kind of have to do? You got to make sure there's money included to enforce it. Absolutely. So most of them, basically, if you were to answer a question about the new frontier, you could just write this. It mostly didn't get passed. All right. Not while Kennedy was alive. So his stuff pretty much got stalled out by the Dixiecrats. Now, one of the things that he's kind of famous for is this thing called SOB. Now, I'm not going to tell you what SOB is, but you may know what that letters stand for. So what happens is Kennedy wants to stop inflation in the steel industry. Because, of course, if steel goes up, housing goes up, automobiles go up, everything goes up. So he brings in labor leaders and steel leaders, and he convinces them together to not raise prices, but also not demand higher wages. So keep inflation in check, right? Well, then what do the steel owners do? They raise prices. And so Kennedy is furious, right? But he can't make them do it, right? Unfortunately. So he'll chew them out, but it doesn't mean much. They call him SOB. So the one major thing Kennedy gets accomplished, and it's pretty remarkable, is a overall reduction in income taxes, a serious reduction in taxes. And it actually works as a stimulus. Guys, if you cut taxes, people will spend money. That is a fact. The question is, will it be enough to stimulate it for everyone, or will it just be enough to make those people money? And that's always the fine line. All right. And so Congress is more than willing to support a tax reduction plan. Okay. So this is a really long chapter, and we will continue with it tomorrow. We will probably conclude it tomorrow. That's my expectation. Okay. So let me stop recording and see if anybody has anything they'd like to ask on what we've done so far or in general.